let's get started, and people are still coming in, but I'll make a start anyway. So hello everyone, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to this second event in Table's COP series on Does Methane Matter? So my name is Tara Garnett, and I'm the director of Table, which is a collaborative project between universities of Oxford, Wageningen University and the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. Just to let you know that this event is being recorded, and there'll be a Q&A session for about half an hour at the end of this event. Please, can you post your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat? And my colleagues Sophie and Jackie will be posting various housekeeping things and links and so forth in the chat itself. So the purpose of today is to explore an often heated and much debated topic, the question of methane, its implications for global warming, what metrics we ought to be using to capture its contribution, and specifically what the implications are or should be, not quite the same thing, for animal agriculture, sort of any animals at all, and if so, which animals in which system. I think it's also really important, and we will be doing this in our conversation, to put the question of methane in the context of our wider goals for animal agriculture, since, as we know, the livestock issue is complicated, given its many interconnected impacts, both positive and negative, for environment and for society. So most of you who are going to be on this call are probably people who work in and around food and climate issues, and you'll be aware that methane is both a potent greenhouse gas and that its potency is greater than CO2, but that it is also a short-lived greenhouse gas. So probably you will be aware that there are different ways of measuring its contribution, with global warming potential and GWP star the most sort of prominent ways, although there are of course others as well. You may have views and preferences as to which may be, preferable to use, or you may be confused about what they actually do measure and how and why these differences pull the debates around livestock in lots of different and often quite polarizing directions. So to try and explore some of these issues, I'm really delighted to have with us this evening 4 panelists who've thought deeply and perhaps quite differently sometimes about methane and its implications for animal farming and for climate policy in general. So these are, and in no particular order, Andy Reisinger, who is the Commissioner on New Zealand's Climate Change Commission and Vice Chair of the IPCC's Working Group 3 report on mitigation. My colleague, John Lynch, who's a researcher here at the University of Oxford, who looks at the environmental consequences of land-based greenhouse gas removal methods for the environment. Claudia Ant, who's a senior scientist at the International Livestock Research Institute's Sustainable Livestock Systems Programme in Kenya, and also the leader of the Mazingira Centre, which focuses on measuring and reducing African livestock environmental impacts, including greenhouse gases. And Martin Persson at Chalmers University, whose work focuses on sustainable land use with a particular interest in climate policy, biofuels and deforestation. So I've given the one-line summary of each of them. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists in turn to really briefly introduce yourselves and your particular interest in methane. And then I'm going to launch into a moderated discussion involving all the panelists, and as I say, there'll be half an hour at the end for questions, although of course you can post your questions during the whole course of the evening. So who'd like to go first? How about you, John?
Okay, thanks Tara, and thanks to everyone joining us today. I'm John Lynch. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. I sit in the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, which is in the Department of Biology. So I have a background in environmental science and agricultural sustainability assessment. So I've done some previous work exploring different ways of reporting and conceptualizing agricultural methane emissions and what that might mean for overall climate. As Tara said, I'm now a bit more focused on different land managements and the contribution they might make to climate change mitigation. But methane also pops up there in terms of peatland restoration and methane impacts, which may be a bit beyond this call, but looking forward to the discussion.
You're muted, Tara.
I was saying, Martin, you go next because you're right above John.
Thank you. Tara, so my name is Martin Persson. I'm a professor at Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg, Sweden. My interest in methane and metrics goes back to my PhD, where I did research on especially how to make the trade-off between mitigating emissions of methane versus carbon dioxide and how to make that economic trade-off. Nowadays, I'm more focused on tropical deforestation and climate policy, but also sustainable food consumption and policies for making food consumption more sustainable. And there, of course, also the issue of reducing methane emissions, reducing meat consumption, and so versus other mitigation options comes up.
Thank you. Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Tara, and hi, everybody. I'm Andy Reisinger. I live in New Zealand, and that's one of the main reasons why I'm interested in methane, because methane is a major, disproportionately high contributor to climate change from New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions. And so the question about how we view methane, but also what we can do about it, methane from livestock industries, is a very pertinent question. I've published both on different methane metrics and the economic implications of using different metrics. I've also been involved in the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, which is an international collaboration that tries to engage both developing and developed countries into getting a grip on their agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, finding ways of reducing them, but also just embedding them in their inventory accounting methods. And obviously through the IPCC, I was involved in coordinating the assessment of greenhouse gas metrics for the mitigation report, but also liaising with the report on physical climate science, which also took a look at greenhouse gas metrics.
Thanks. And Claudia, last but not least.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for having me here. As Tara said, I'm a senior scientist with ILRI and leading the Mazanguera Center, where we look at environmental impact from livestock, and are one of the, if not the only center within Africa that actually has a lot of technology available to measure methane from livestock systems. And my background is I'm a dairy nutritionist. I've worked on my PhD already on measuring enteric methane emissions. After that, I've also worked on different scales of measuring methane emissions from facilities and comparing these measurements to actually inventory emissions to make sure that the accounting actually is equal to what we measure. But I've also recently, with a lot of other colleagues, published effective mitigation strategies for enteric methane emissions, where we were quite long on doing a gigantic literature review on all the studies out there on enteric methane, and found some effective strategies to reduce enteric methane. So on the livestock side, I've worked in the US and I've been working in Global South. So I've been trained or have background of different production systems and the issues of the Global North and Global South and the differences of both. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. Thanks to you. So just to kind of kick things off a bit, Martin, do you think you could give us a sort of ABC introduction to how methane is actually different from CO2, and perhaps what the differences, the implications of this difference are for climate mitigation?
I could have a try. Of course, both carbon dioxide and methane are greenhouse gases. So emitting them into the atmosphere, raising their concentrations, leads to climate change and negative impacts on ecosystems, on human societies, and so on. But as Tara said initially, they differ in strength. So how much an extra molecule of carbon dioxide or methane contributes to warming the globe when introduced into the atmosphere. And they also differ in their atmospheric lifetime. So methane is both a more potent greenhouse gas than compared to carbon dioxide, but much more short-lived. But it's also worth noting, I think, that when weighing these two aspects together, every ton of methane emitted causes more warming or more climate change over the next several centuries, like 600 years, compared to an emission of a ton of carbon dioxide. And this is due to the inertia of the climate system. So even though the atmospheric lifetime of the methane molecules is quite short, about 12 years, the climate impact of methane emissions are far from short-lived. And I think that's fair to recognize. But the difference between methane and carbon dioxide are not only sort of quantitative. There's also a qualitative difference that has implications both for when we think about what kind of climate targets or emission targets we need to meet, and also the metrics that the discussion I think we're gonna get into later tonight. So the difference is this: when we emit methane into the atmosphere, that methane is continuously sort of broken down and removed from the atmosphere. And this means that if we have a constant emission of methane, that will lead to a sort of a corresponding increase in the level of methane concentrations, and therefore a certain level of warming or climate change. For carbon dioxide, however, a share of the carbon we introduce into the atmosphere will stay there more or less indefinitely, which means that if we have a constant rate of carbon dioxide emissions, the concentrations will continue to increase indefinitely. And what this means is if we're going to limit future warming and meet some sort of climate target like the 1.5 degrees target we've set up in the Paris Agreement, we need to bring carbon dioxide emissions down to zero. So we need to have net zero carbon dioxide emissions in order to stabilize climate at some sort of level. For methane, however, because it's broken down and removed, we can allow some degree of continuous methane emissions because the warming that will lead to is ultimately finite. So this means there's a trade-off between cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide, so how much we've emitted since more or less the start of the Industrial Revolution up to this point, and sort of continuous emissions of methane. So put it simply, the faster we reduce fossil carbon dioxide emissions by shutting down coal-powered power plants or by changing our transportation systems to electric cars, electric mobility, and so on, the more beef that emits methane we can allow ourselves to eat for a given climate target. And of course, vice versa. The faster we reduce, or the faster we change our diets in order to reduce methane emissions, the more time it gives us to reduce emissions of fossil carbon dioxide. However, I think it's really important also to recognize that it's for the climate targets we're talking about globally now, the 1.5 degree target of the Paris Agreement. It's not a question of either or. We need to reduce emissions of both methane and carbon dioxide in order to have a chance to meet those targets. So now the historical emissions of carbon dioxide we've had to date and the rate of methane emissions we have today gives rise to about 0.8 degrees warming for carbon dioxide and a 0.5 degree warming for methane. So if we're going to have a chance to stay below ultimately 1.5 or get close to 1.5 degrees ultimately, we need both quite rapid and quite drastic reductions in the emissions of both these gases.
Thanks, Martin. So I guess if anyone wants to chip in at this point and contradict anything Martin said, then perhaps just go on to the question of the metric itself, because it is about the methane, but the metric is a kind of a way of somehow trying to capture its impacts in a way that is useful for policy making. So global warming potential is the sort of the old kid on the block, and GWP star is a newer one that was developed by colleagues at Oxford. Perhaps, Andy, you can give an overview of how they're different and what that difference actually means?
Yeah, I can have a go, and then John can correct me. And I'm only going to focus on the two metrics that you mentioned. There's the global warming potential with a time horizon of 100 years, GWP 100, which is the metric that's used in reporting emissions under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, under the Paris Agreement, and is quite widely used, but often not, often without much thought whether it's actually the metric you want to use. And then, as you said, GWP star is a new metric. And I guess the key point up front is those two metrics measure different things. So it's not that one is better than the other one. They measure different things, and whether one or the other is suitable depends on what you want to measure. That's always the thing. So GWP 100 basically compares if I emit 1 pulse of methane into the atmosphere, that'll change the energy balance between incoming energy from the sun and energy that leaves the Earth through the atmosphere, and it makes the Earth warmer as a result. The same is true if I emit a ton of carbon dioxide. Same thing happens. It changes the energy balance, makes the Earth warmer. But as Martin said, methane is short-lived. So GWP 100 says, if I emit a ton of methane today, over the next 100 years, how much does the energy balance change compared to emitting 1 ton of carbon dioxide? And based on latest physical science updated, it's about 27. So 1 ton of methane changes the energy balance over the next 100 years about 27 times as much as if I emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide. But that's for a single pulse emission. And that's good to know, but it doesn't capture the fact that methane is short-lived. So actually there's a lot more change early on in the first 20 to 30 years and much less change later on as I get towards the 100 years. And of course, the other thing is that we don't tend to emit a singular pulse of methane or carbon dioxide, especially from livestock systems. It's continuously coming out of systems, and we don't choose to have livestock one day and then no livestock the next day. So what people were asking is, can I have something that better describes what happens if I emit methane continuously? And GWP star is designed to then tell us how much does the temperature change further if I change my rate of methane emissions over time. And so that's picking up on the fact that the warming from methane doesn't accumulate because it's short-lived. So if I emit methane 1 year and then I emit another pulse of methane 100 years later, those two warming effects don't add up to each other because the warming from the first pulse of methane is mostly gone by the time I emit the next methane 100 years later. Whereas for carbon dioxide, if I emit carbon dioxide 100 years ago, and then again 100 years later, that adds up to it because the warming from the first carbon dioxide pulse is still heating the atmosphere almost without change. And so it might be useful to use an analog, which is, imagine I drink a bottle of whiskey. Alcohol is a short-lived but powerful effect on me. So if I drink a bottle of whiskey, I get comatose in my case, but over the next 24 hours, I'm sobering up again. So if I apply GWP to that, that would tell me how drunk am I on average over the course of the day, without quite capturing the fact that I'm completely out of it for the first few hours and almost sober at the end of the day. But I could now drink a bottle of whiskey every day, in which case I'm constantly drunk. GWP star would correctly tell me that I'm not getting any more drunk if I keep drinking whiskey every day. I'm permanently drunk, I'm constantly drunk, but I'm not getting any more drunk. And that's important because if I was, in the case of carbon dioxide, let's just say, as a comparison, if I'm sniffing glue and that's start doing permanent damage to my brain cells, if I sniff glue every day I accumulate more and more brain damage. The same is not the case with a short-lived pollutant like alcohol. So GWP star would capture that, but also we've got to be aware GWP star only tells me how much more drunk do I get. It doesn't tell me how drunk am I right now. And so it depends what we want to know. But I better pass over to John in case he wants to phrase it slightly differently.
Thanks, Andy. And you forgot the cirrhosis of the liver factor, but we'll move on with the analogy. Thanks.
Yes, all analogs are limping. Don't take me literally, please.
John.
Thanks. I think Martin and Andy have given very nice explanations of the science there with some very thought-provoking analogs. So rather than get hung up on the metrics themselves, what I'm really interested in is what will these different ways of thinking reveal or hide to us. So first off, I want to acknowledge straight away and reinforce the message that methane is a greenhouse gas. So of course, by definition, the less of it we emit, the better for the climate. And that stands regardless of any kind of metrics or framings. So everyone should keep that in mind the whole way through. But if we return to this kind of qualitative difference, as Martin pointed out, what I have argued in various places is that kind of physically, something that you emit and has a permanent effect is quite fundamentally different from something that you emit and has a predominantly temporary effect. And in terms of kind of global temperature increase, it's essentially that one will have a cumulative impact, whereas the other will not. And there are ways that we can try and compare each individual emission on a like-for-like basis. And for some purposes, that may still be valuable to show, what can be achieved if I choose to emit rather than not emit this. But if we do try and constrain them and end up saying, okay, methane is just like carbon dioxide, but 27 times worse, that loses a lot of detail, and it ultimately comes down to contestable kind of social and economic assumptions about, for example, how much you want to discount future damages to the climate versus present day damages. And if you take that approach, because that doesn't really reflect the actual climate physics of things, then you can't track your outcomes towards any overall temperature goal. And what I think is the bigger issue actually is that, and in terms of the broader debate that we're starting today, is that it may obscure kind of the breadth of options and the breadth of debate that we should really be having here. So I think Martin put nicely that the trade-off, and this is exactly what GWP star is trying to highlight, that emitting a ton of carbon dioxide has an essentially permanent ratcheting up of temperature, which is not really equivalent to any amount of individual methane emissions. In terms of long-term global temperature change, it's more equivalent to adding a new indefinite flow of methane. So that means that if you're choosing, or trying to figure out what does it mean if I go on this flight or not, how many burgers is that equivalent to me eating this week? It's not really equivalent to any number of burgers. You going on that flight is diminishing the atmospheric warming space for some level of methane emission to go on forever. So in terms of this discussion, each flight is essentially meaning that's one less cow that we can have in the world for all of our lives and all of our descendants. Is that useful information? That's for people to judge based on their priorities and how they make those comparisons. But I certainly think it's an interesting way to conceptualize things, and it's a comparison that would you just totally wouldn't realize that was the actual dynamic if you were fixed into this thinking, okay, methane is just like CO2 but a bit worse. So I'm going to zoom out a bit now and try and put this in context of sort of overall global warming and where we are. So as was said earlier, we currently have about 0.8 degrees C of warming from carbon dioxide, about 0.5 degrees C of warming from methane. If you're wondering how come they add up to more than the 1.1 to 1.2 overall warming where we currently are, that's because of the negative warming impact of aerosols, but we definitely don't want to continue emitting them. But that's a detail we'll skip over for now. So if we stopped emitting methane, then much of that 0.5 degrees that they're currently causing would be undone. which is great, obviously. But if we didn't bother getting to net zero CO2, then we're adding at least 0.1 degrees per decade just from our current CO2 emission rates. So at the very best, stopping methane would kind of keep us where we are now for about 5 decades. And then beyond that, if we didn't bother getting to net zero CO2, we would have used up all that temperature space and then carry on getting hotter. Whereas if we stopped CO2 emissions today, then we wouldn't be increasing that 0.8 degrees from CO2 anymore. And even if we didn't stop, if we didn't reduce methane and we just kept it where we were, we would just have that fairly stable 0.5 degrees C from methane. So we would have essentially solved climate change, skipping over the details of aerosols once again. I mean, stopping CO2 is no easy task. And within the feasible kind of pathways to actually get to net zero CO2, we're not going to do that fast enough to remain under 1.5 degrees as in the Paris Agreement. So it is going to be essential to reduce methane a lot, and likely have a very significant amount of negative CO2 emissions to take us back from on a likely overshoot above 1.5 degrees. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that's the kind of dynamic of these things, and that there are, for any kind of climate target, there are ultimately different physical requirements for one gas versus the other, again, that you wouldn't appreciate by imagining them as direct like for likes. And lastly, before I wrap up, to try and get at this question of, is methane from livestock important? As a very quick kind of back of the envelope calculation, we can, because the warming from methane is primarily due to ongoing emission rates in comparison to carbon dioxide, where we have to think of all the emissions we've ever emitted, we can actually slice up that 0.5 degrees of warming from methane across its current emission sources, and that will actually give us a reasonably close approximation of direct temperature change. So of anthropogenic methane emissions, as I consult my notes here, about 40% of those come from energy. So natural gas is just fossil methane. About 20% come from waste. So we have landfill with decaying organic matter, which is lost as methane to the atmosphere. And then the remaining 40 to 50% comes from agriculture. And ruminant methane is the major source of agricultural methane. So about 30% of overall anthropogenic methane is from enteric fermentation. So cows and sheep eat grass, their rumen, their front gut bacteria help to break that down, but they burp out methane as a byproduct. So that's an extremely significant source of methane. If we scale that down, so I said it was 30% of methane emissions. So about 30% of 0.5 degrees of warming is somewhere between 0.15 and 0.2 degrees C of temperature increase. So is this a significant amount? Yes, definitely. And if we're serious about 1.5 degrees, then it's a fairly significant chunk of that. If we're not serious about 1.5 degrees and we don't get to net zero CO2, then it's an increasingly small fraction of, obviously. But remembering what we said about that qualitative difference, if we just keep the emission rates the same, then we kind of keep, let's say, 0.2 degrees C warming from methane. Whereas if we keep CO2 emissions the same, then they're adding extra warming decade upon decade. So it is a substantial chunk of our global temperature increase, but it's not kind of it's not a do or die if we are going to achieve any of our climate targets. I mean, it's going to be essential to reduce that to some extent, just based on realistic pathways to net zero CO2. But we do have some wiggle room in terms of how much we need to reduce that methane by, and especially that smaller share of ruminant methane, as Martin was saying, depending on what we want to do in terms of the speed of our decarbonisation. So I'll wrap up for there, but yeah, hopefully that puts things in some global context.
Thanks, John. I mean, I imagine there's going to be some comments from Martin and Andy, which it will be good to kind of weave into the discussion, but I also just want to bring in Claudia. Before I do that, I think what perhaps you didn't discuss, John, and perhaps we can bring it later into the conversation, is what happens when the rate of methane emissions increases or indeed falls. But before doing that, I mean, we've been talking about this this gas as if it were kind of somehow disembodied and contextless. And of course, it comes from, among other things, livestock, and livestock have multifunctional both benefits and costs to society and the environment, and the role of livestock plays out very, very differently in different parts of the world. So, you know, we're also talking about the science, but as we all know, the science is never just the science. It is always contextually kind of relevant or irrelevant. So, Claudia, I wonder if you can talk about how you see things as you go about your work, working with smallholders in sub-Saharan Africa, and your experiences also of working in Germany, and the challenges that you see.
Thank you, Tara. So when we're working in the global south, often we see that we still have population growth, and we have overall low animal protein consumption, much lower than what we would see in the global north. Often we're talking about a third, in some countries even less. And the access to protein itself is not the same as in the global north. So given the situation that the population is growing, the projection is that livestock demand for livestock products is going to increase as well. This is especially important for rural areas where nutrition is often limiting, and people are living on marginal lands where often cropping is not necessarily an option. And livestock does actually provide a very crucial part of nutrition, not just in regards of protein, but other nutrients as well. So working in Africa, from my perspective, what we can do and what we're trying to do is to help countries actually increase their production, but make sure that we do that with fewer resources and be more effective and making systems more efficient. That doesn't mean that we want to go to systems how they're in the global north, because these systems have their own issues, as we know, and we can elaborate on this later if there's time. But just to really optimize the systems that we have in place and make sure farmers have the tools that they need to optimize resource use and to optimize production. And when it comes to emissions, I'm not going to talk to farmers about emissions. I'm going to talk to farmers about production and adaptation, because the effects of climate change are very severe. We had a huge drought in the Horn of Africa. It has killed millions of livestock. So these are all emissions that actually have produced no food for people in the end. And we can't have that happen. So we do need to also look at adaptation quite a bit. When it comes to the global north, we do have actually a lot of access to protein from consumer side, and we have an overproduction even from many countries on livestock protein. So the population is not expected to grow much, neither is the demand. The per capita demand is also not going to grow much. So when we look at the climate targets in regards to reducing enteric methane emissions, it sort of looks somewhat easier because we can actually make absolute reductions, because of a lot of the strategies that are out there are applicable for systems in the global north, and they would reduce absolute emissions. But the problem here really is that the strategies that we have at the moment, they are technically feasible, but they're not economically feasible. So we have other challenges there, how we're going to reduce it. But the challenge is overall, what I want to highlight is different, because we don't see we don't have the nutritional needs in the global north because we have the access to protein and other alternative protein sources as well. Compared to animal protein, production is high. We have a lot of export, and we're not lacking animal production, and we're not anticipating a big increase in animal production. So I think with that, I've outlined well the different challenges really that we're seeing for the different systems. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. So just going back to, you've placed this in context. You've all explained how methane works and the way the metrics measure things differently. As I understand it, the GWP star metric, taking a situation such as, I don't know, Kenyan livestock growth trajectories, where livestock numbers would increase, although they might not increase in pace with population. So per capita protein intakes might stay the same or even fall. But using a GWP star metric, Kenya would be more penalized for its growth in livestock numbers than it would under a different metric. Is that correct? And if that is so, then how do we think about that when we think about both historical and future contributions and the justice implications? Who would like? Andy.
Just quickly on that one, I think we've got to be careful not to, when you say Kenya would be penalized, GBP star just tells you what happens if you do something. Equally, GWP 100 tells you simply what happens if you do something. It just tells you something about a different aspect of the climate system. But when we say Kenya would be penalized more, it assumes that we keep the same numerical target of what Kenya ought to achieve, and that's wrong. It's a bit like if if somebody says, "Hey, you owe me $100," and then you say, "Well, can I pay you back in euros?" But it's still 100. That doesn't make sense, right? So we've got to think about what do we expect different countries to do, and then we've just got to check, does the metric report what we want the country to achieve? So we've got to be very careful not to think there's a single fixed target for every country out there, and it doesn't matter if we change the metric, the target is the same. That sort of construes it the wrong way around. We've got to be very careful not to do that, because otherwise we go in all, there's been a lot of debate about whether one metric or the other is unfair. It depends what it's used for. And the target should change if we change the metric. Otherwise, we're doing the great switcheroo and nobody is none the wiser.
But I have fallen into the trap that is a very common trap to fall into, which is that certain metrics serve different interest groups, or are perceived to serve different interest groups. So I think that is where we get into the discussion about how these different metrics get used and abused by different groups who are arguing for different visions of livestock and of whether there should be livestock at all. Martin, I have your hand up and I see you're nodding, John. So how about you go first, Martin?
Sure, and I think this is where some of the maybe confusion and around GWP star comes in terms of, one is sort of the science of it and what the metric actually means, which I think both Andy and John has given a good overview of. The question is then, what is the policy implications of this, and for what kind of policies you use to address methane emissions and mitigate methane and so on. And that's where I think some people are, in my view at least, have gone wrong. And because GWP star says, well, if you continue the same level of methane emissions, you won't get any additional warming. Well, additional compared to the warming we have today, that is already causing a lot of climate damages. But that doesn't mean, and some then have claimed that this means that as long as you keep your methane emissions constant, you shouldn't be sort of penalized, have to pay taxes or something for that. The implicit assumption there is that sort of is what is often called grandfathering. So if you have already is emitting methane, then you have the right to continue to do that. But if we talked about, there's a limited emission space for methane, And the question is how we distribute that between farmers in a country, between countries in the world, between the global south and the global north, and so on. So I think another perspective is, of course, to say that every methane emission that we have will give rise to more warming than if we didn't emit the methane. And that's a reason to tax those emissions to account for the common damages that occurs to society. So I think that's where the confusion between the science and the policy implications comes in.
Thanks. John, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree. But where I think we're maybe being a bit narrower than would be useful is not appreciating the nuance here. So I think in terms of our overall climate targets, I imagine many people think that, oh, it comes down to every country, every sector, every business reaching net zero as conventionally understood in net zero GW 100. But IPCC, for example, have never implied that, and I don't think they will, because it just doesn't make sense to set that target across different emitters. And then even if you were to set it at a kind of country level, there are a whole range of different routes you might imagine towards a country implementing a tax or other kind of subsidy regime to get that balance across farmers versus energy and so on. And this is where we need to have really interesting conversations about what do we actually want our climatically sustainable future to look like. And there is not one answer there, but I think that these discussions aren't happening, partly because we're taking a slightly too simplistic understanding, often coming down to net zero. So I just wanted to expand also a bit more on the ways that we might bring down ruminant methane, because we had it a bit from Claudia, but I want to make sure we don't overlook this given the table audience. So I think that there's actually lots of really exciting ways and quite plausible ways that we can reduce ruminant methane. Things like, and also responding to some of the questions I've seen, things like dietary supplements, conventional animal breeding. Now that we have the technology to recognize kind of higher versus lower methane emitting animals, and even just kind of improving animal health will mean they can grow quicker, you lose less through kind of death and disease. So your net result is that you have more output for less methane. And I absolutely think we do need to look into these measures and have policy tools to support them to help bring down ruminant methane. I'm just not convinced that the policy tools and the targets to do that make sense if they're the same policy tools and targets for CO2. And that's this is related, I think, to why it becomes such a contentious issue, because we've kind of had two framings presented here. One is that, okay, for every ton of CO2 you choose to emit or not emit, you have a much bigger impact for actually quite a long time compared to every ton of CO2 that you choose to emit or not emit. So that reinforces the perspective of ruminant livestock are bad, we should just reduce them as much as possible. We've had the other perspective showing that, well, if we just keep ruminant methane the same, it's up to 0.2 degrees C. It's a significant chunk, but it's potentially manageable depending on what happens with other decarbonisation, and could still potentially achieve even quite strict climate targets. And both of those perspectives are true, and they're not necessarily incompatible with each other. And how to have that societal conversation about, well, what do we value and how do we grapple with these and prioritize is where I hope we can go moving forward. But because they're both true and they both kind of reinforce pre-existing opinions that people have about what the food system should look like and what the role of livestock are, then it has kind of maintained a fairly polarized debate in some ways, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, sorry, Andy.
Just quickly, so it might be useful to get some other comparisons of scale. So basically, the amount of climate change we avoid if we reduce livestock methane emissions from a business as usual trajectory down to as low as we think might be possible with technology and demand side changes, is about 0.1 degrees, because you can't get it to 0. And I've heard nobody claim that you can get livestock emissions to 0. So we could avoid about 0.1 degrees of warming. And it's worthwhile comparing, for example, if we choose or not choose to avoid all CO2 emissions from aviation by 2050. So either we carry on with CO2 emissions from aviation at current levels, or we reduce CO2 emissions from aviation to 0 by 2050. That would avoid about 0.03 degrees of Celsius, so only a third of that over the 21st century. Of course, it would keep carrying on, which is why we have to get all CO2 emissions as low as possible. But in terms of, for the 21st century, what we do about livestock methane has a 3 times bigger impact than what we choose to do about CO2 emissions from aviation. You can also do a similar number if we get CO2 emissions associated with global steel production to 0 by 2050, or maintain at the current level. That would still have a smaller impact on the 21st century climate than what we choose to do about livestock methane. So even though 0.1 degrees sounds small, if you compare it with specific CO2 emitting sectors, it's actually a really substantive chunk, and it's worthwhile keeping it in mind. But again, it's not an either or, and I think it's really important. What's abundantly clear from all the IPCC assessments that we've done is that if we want to limit warming to anywhere near 1.5 degrees, and 1.5 degrees is pretty much slipping from our grasp as we speak, but we could try and limit to 1.6, 1.7 degrees. If we want to get anywhere near that, it's not an either or, it's we have to pull out all stops from all sectors. So a comparison, if we didn't reduce one source at all and only the other one, is useful to understand the physics, but it sort of misleads us into, do we realize what we have to do to limit climate change to a sort of barely manageable state? We have to address all of those sources, not one or the other.
So to kind of continue that point, and to bring in Claudia here as well. So we've been talking about the sort of methane versus CO2. I'm really interested to know about measures that, things that you can do with livestock that actually synergize between methane reductions and CO2 reductions. And again, keeping within the sector where you see the possible trade-offs. So again, listening to some of the debates around livestock that are going on out there, you could say there is a posse that says, methane is the worst thing in the world. It's got a high global warming potential. Therefore, best to either not eat meat at all, or intensify or switch to monogastric systems where you get less methane per unit of output, versus the contrary point of view that says the more you switch towards those systems, perhaps the more intensive monogastric systems, the more fossil fuel dependent you are, because these are very confined animal feeding operations. They use grains that are grown using nitrous oxide fertilizers, etc., etc. So I'm just wondering, is the dichotomy A, as stark as sometimes it's made out to be in the debate, and B, are there ways you could, cut across multiple gases? Claudia, and particularly as you pointed out, cost.
So usually intensive systems have higher carbon dioxide emissions, but when we look at the carbon dioxide emissions in regards to emissions of total product, it's not as big. The low middle income country usually will have maybe like 5 to 10% fossil fuel, and then in the US maybe you have 15% per liter of milk, for example, of the emissions that go out. So the next question with metric, which maybe would be more for John to answer in that regards, but you can have trade-offs in, so some people working on more sustainable pasture production of cattle, stopping degradation of pasture, because I guess there we don't only have methane emissions in some of these systems, because if we're doing overstocking of animals on pasture, we don't have good pasture management, we actually will lose soil carbon which then also adds to the atmosphere. So you have methane and carbon dioxide emissions from these systems. So if you can improve pasture management, then you actually may be able to capture them extra carbon dioxide, or if you do put silvopastoral systems. So there is to me, more of a relation there, although it's biogenic carbon, but I am assuming that when you have carbon dioxide from the soil released, we can look at it similarly to fossil carbon, and maybe that's sort of a discussion we also want to have for a little bit. And I do think we have to make sure that we're not having other trade-offs with nutrient cycling, because we can't look just on emissions. We also need to look at nutrient imports and exports of systems. We need to make sure we don't have nutrient hotspots. We need to make sure we don't have more dead zones around the oceans, which are partially through crop production for livestock, but also through livestock manure and also normal agriculture. So I think we need to make sure we're looking at the big picture in adoption of practices. Still, none of these practices have shown actually cost efficient for the additives and so on. So it's really hard. And we do need to figure out how we actually get the practices on the ground, if it may be through policy change or other incentives to make farmers make the change, because we cannot just expect them to pay for it because they already are in small enough margins. So we need to policy needs to find a solution, because it's probably most likely that only, like for organic, a few consumers are willing to pay an extra price for animal products that have lower emissions. And also in the end, it's probably price that will drive consumption of animal products more than people deciding we're eating less animal products, because we see how much protein is overconsumed in the global north. We really don't need to eat that much. Meanwhile, we have the lack of protein consumption in other countries. So it's not the science here which plays a role. I think it's policy action and getting people actually committed to wanting to make a change, because they actually see how climate change affects their life. And I think the concept of climate change is very abstract for a lot of people, and they may not feel very affected by it. But if they understand how it does, then they may be more willing to make a change in their behavior. And it's not just eating meat or not eating meat, flying or whatever. It's many aspects in our life, right? Thank you.
Thank you. If we don't have any more to sort of immediate comments from the panel, we do. John.
Yeah, I just wanted to expand a bit on some of those points, because I think that how this discussion relates to kind of overall food system sustainability is really key. So as we know, I'm sure most people involved in table know that we need a really quite systemic shift to make the food system more sustainable. And if we were actually to achieve that, and we were to cease deforestation, to use land more sustainably and have it managed more appropriately per location, reduce the amount of food that we waste, move to healthier diets, and in parts of the world like here in Northwest Europe, that would involve eating less overall and eating less animal products in particular, and also kind of more fully recognize the value of biodiversity and prioritized higher welfare systems. I think that would already put quite a significant cap on ruminant numbers, certainly much less than they are today. If we stack on top of that lower number of ruminants some of the more, what I feel are the more achievable methane reduction measures that I went through earlier, then I think that would get us quite a long way in the overall methane reduction that we need. And when we're at that point, I think it would make sense to take a step back and say, okay, we're not at net zero methane. but we have or we know how to achieve a more sustainable food system, and to get to all the way to zero or net zero methane, it's going to involve maybe heavier trade-offs or less popular, stronger policy interventions around changing behaviors and diets. I think that's where we might conclude actually it's not worth pushing for this semi-arbitrary net zero methane figure. But it's really key, to think about this from a holistic sense.
Yeah. Martin, you want to come in, and then Claudia?
Yeah, maybe first a quick response just to what John said last. I mean, and one thing, again, the key takeaway here is that we don't need to, for climate stabilization, we don't need to get to net zero methane. And we haven't mentioned nitrous oxide, but luckily we also don't have to get to net zero nitrous oxide, because then we would really be fried. We could use land, right? So because it will give rise to, when we fertilize it, be it through artificial fertilizers or manure or whatever, we get nitrous oxide emissions. But nitrous oxide emissions are also broken down, and as long as we sort of have a stable level of emissions, we have a stable climate impact. So we don't need to get to net zero, and I think we do increasingly need to recognize that that's hopefully we get closer to net zero climate or carbon emissions, and really try to push down emissions. Yes, there is this trade-off, exactly how high emissions should be. But I think really another takeaway from me from this discussion, hearing what you said, John, Claudia, in terms of what kind of actions can be taken to reduce emissions, but also the sort of the global distribution aspects of that, who gets to use up that emission space we have for methane. What you said, Andy, about the 1.5 degree target becoming out of reach for us. I think really the metric discussion is more of a red herring. That's not where our focus should be. We need to think about, how can we put in place technical changes that reduces methane emissions? How can we make people eat less beef where we eat a lot, both for health reasons, for climate reasons, and so on? And how can we decarbonize our societies? And we need to. That's what we should focus on, not bicker over greenhouse gas metrics.
Thanks. Claudia, and then I'd quite like to move on to the questions, because they are definitely stacking up.
I just wanted to make the point that because we haven't talked about as black and white about eating meat or not eating meat, because a sustainable food system actually involves having animals. So there have been studies on circularity and the most efficient land use, and that system actually involves having animals and having animal production, just for the fact that some land is not suited for crop production, and also that animals, ruminants, do consume a lot of byproducts produced within other agricultural systems. So they basically help us to use these products. And also in Africa, some farmers only have cows because they need the manure, because they don't have money to buy fertilizer. So they basically have a cow for the manure. So to me, just for the people who are out there wondering if we should all be vegetarian or not, if we wanted the most sustainable system is not a vegetarian system. It's a system that involves animals. Thank you.
I think that discussion, I think there are quite a lot of questions that are on the lines of, should we all be vegan or not? And perhaps some of the others can comment on that. There's the should-can question, but I mean, who'd like to? I mean, I don't know if this is something where there will be some consensus on the panel or disagreement. Should we? These are very black and white questions.
I'll raise my head above the parapet, Tara. In terms of an absolutely kind of optimal agricultural system where you're kind of only using land in the single most sustainable way, I think it wouldn't be entirely animal free. I think there'd be a space for ruminants, for nutrient recycling, potentially kind of pigs and poultry in revalorizing food waste, but I think it would be really quite negligible, the amount of meat that would supply, especially when you consider spreading that around a global population of up to 8 billion. So maybe not the single most sustainable will be vegan, but it's going to be lower impact on a lot of measures. But I'd also highlight that they aren't our only options. It's not to do things like in the single most environmentally efficient manner versus just not caring. There are a whole range of sustainable intermediates that will depend on what we want the landscape to look like, what our values are, and what we like to eat or not.
Yeah, thanks, John. Martin.
Yeah, just to maybe chime in, I agree, John, and I think we need to be careful, especially recognize that ultimately these are normative questions. So, and how we define what sustainability is will have a huge impact on what the answer is, whether we factor in, or to which extent we factor in animal welfare or potential rights of other sentient beings and so on, will have an impact on what the answer to that question is. So
Yeah.
I don't think we are bound to disagree on this depending on our values, because it's not a scientific question.
Andy, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I was going to chime in because I agree with both Martin and John. I mean, it's always easy to answer black and white questions by saying, well, it's a bit more nuanced. It's clear that, you know, the lower emissions we generate through our food consumption, the less climate change the less we're contributing to climate change. But there's a whole range of factors that influence that. I mean, the only other thing maybe to add is that personally, I'm quite hesitant with the label sustainable food systems, because what's sustainable is also dependent on what else is going on. It's a bit like saying, going back to my earlier analogy, me drinking half a bottle of whiskey clearly is sustainable. I'm not going to get any more drunk over time, but it depends whether I'm driving a 40-ton truck or whether I'm retired sitting in my apartment and watch football all day long. It's a sustainable is in itself quite a normative, value-laden label that isn't often helpful if it's applied in the absolute. And I think that same applies with the diet that you choose.
Yeah. John, did you have one other comment to add to that?
Yeah, it relates straight to that. So it is definitely subjective what sustainable is, but I think one thing we can say a bit more certainly, and we demonstrated this in a paper using GWP star, is that business as usual trends in the food system are very clearly not sustainable. And we looked at emission pathways if we carry on increasing demand for livestock products and just overall production. And the extra warming from the food system under that pathway by itself takes us past 1.5 degrees, even if we decarbonize tomorrow. So what a sustainable food system looks like is, yeah, there are various ways, and it's hard to define, but I think it's quite clear that the current trends are not sustainable.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, well, look, I'd like to move on to some of the questions. One is quite a specific one from Ian Davis, who writes that research at Rothamsted and other sites is revealing that grazed pasture creates a layer of hydroxyl radicals close to the ground, causing near immediate breakdown of a proportion of the methane emitted while grazing. Also, the figures used for ruminant emissions are derived from studies looking at modern intensive cattle in isolation, which are unlikely to be representative of extensively grazed cattle or Brahman-type cattle common in hot climates. Will these be accounted for? So I'm not sure about who will be doing the accounting, but those two questions are like, does anyone have to go with them? Andy, you've got your hand up.
So just on the Rothamsted research, I mean, the average lifetime of methane in the atmosphere is in the order of 10 years. So methane that comes out of a cow might spend, a few seconds in the surface area of grass. So I would say that effect ought to be negligible for its impact on how long methane hangs around for. It's just because it's dispersed too quickly and it's not breaking down instantly. Even if the hydroxyl concentration is higher. So that strikes me as probably not relevant. And I suspect that Claudia is best placed to answer the question about Brahman cattle. But I'd be happy to have a go if you want me to, Claudia.
So what is true, at least for Africa, we have very few data points. So we do need to validate current inventory accounting. And we actually do even find conflicting, our lab actually also has conflicting answers as the higher or lower, depending on if we use activity data, that means data that was collected on farms and calculate emissions based on that, or on the chamber measurements where we have cows in the chamber to measure. We established an SF6 where we can actually measure methane from pastures. And that has been done in Latin America to quite extent already, and also in New Zealand. And I do think, from what I know, the emission factors were not that much off there, but I haven't looked that much in detail on it. I think the bigger picture we need to look at here is really just, it's because it doesn't change our baseline right now if we're 5 or 10% off, but we do need to go down because we know we have how much methane we have in the atmosphere and by how much it needs to be reduced. So even if we're a little bit uncertain in our overall measurement techniques, it does not make a difference that we need to reduce the emissions.
Thanks. And did you want to add something? Then I've got another question that I think is really worth asking. So.
No, I think, sorry, I kept my hand up by accident. I think we should carry on.
Okay, so this is a question, just reading it, it was a question about policy. So carbon trading has a big role to play in the journey to net zero. We have a carbon price. How do we get to a methane price if there's no equivalence? And how do we incentivize methane reduction if we have no methane price? John.
I'll start, but then Andy's probably better to take over. I mean, we do have a methane price at the moment. It just doesn't really capture the full equivalence. And as I said right at the start, the best kind of justifications involve potentially sensible but also contestable economic assumptions. But I think for now it actually doesn't matter too much, because we do have methods and pathways to reducing methane, and it does actually make some sense just to look for measures to bring things down across the board. It's when we're getting close to net zero and thinking about what do we really need to eliminate and how do we set offset requirements that I think these nuances are going to become a bit more significant. And ultimately, my personal preference there is to have eventual long-term targets that are different for different gases. But I think this is something where there's more research and kind of policy discussion needed.
Great. Sorry, I've got so many questions, and there was one which I have just lost it now, but there was a question that was more or less, if I can paraphrase it, the point that given that there were methane emissions from wild animals in the past, I'm just trying to find the question, how is farmed animals different? Andy.
So if we look at the trend in methane concentrations over the last few hundred years, which we know from ice cores, also from snow cores, we can see clearly that methane concentrations were reasonably stable over the last couple of thousand years and have shot up quite markedly. And that's strongly correlated with livestock husbandry. So from that, we can sort of conclude that the decline in wild bison population, for example, globally is vastly outpaced by the increase in farmed animals. It might be at the country level that it's slightly different, but at the global scale, our livestock husbandry is generating far more methane than we ever lost by killing off the native ruminants.
Thanks. Yeah. Did you have your hand up, Claudia, or your no, that was the same. Okay, there's another one which was about I read what farmers write on social media, but I don't join in. Livestock farmers feel threatened. A common response is that, quotes, ruminant animals have not added a single atom of carbon to the atmosphere. The animals are part of the carbon cycle. There's a feeling that ruminants are just a diversion from the real problem, humans removing carbon from the earth and putting it into the atmosphere. How would you counter the argument?
So I think I typed a mini answer to this. But one point is that, okay, maybe they're not literally adding carbon atoms to the atmosphere in the same way that fossil sources are, but their non-CO2 emissions are still a significant chunk of overall global warming, as we've gone through. And even though I might think it's sensible to have separate targets for them potentially, it doesn't mean that we just forget about them all and you can go and emit as much methane or nitrous oxide as you like. So it's kind of conflating slightly separate issues there that need both to be challenged.
Does it also not say something about the framing of the discussion rather than the kind of the substance, the way in which some of these discussions about farming and diets are, what they're like out there? Which
yeah, I think that we've all kind of highlighted that to plausibly stay at or under 1.5 degrees, it's not an either or. And we have to recognize that, and that gives limited scope for kind of my sector versus another sector. And the initial thing is just to get everything down as much as you can. It's the longer term and the kind of exacting requirements and how to share out the effort equitably across different sectors is where it gets a bit more challenging, but that doesn't mean that you just choose one or the other right now.
Yeah, thanks. Martin and then Andy.
Yeah, just maybe an addition from my perspective, working on tropical deforestation. We just had a big review paper out on what is driving deforestation across the tropics, and all evidence points that expanding pastures is the primary driver of tropical deforestation, and tropical deforestation accounts for roughly 10% of global carbon emissions. So, and that is one way through which ruminant animals indirectly is contributing to quite substantive carbon emissions globally.
Thanks. Andy.
Yeah, I just noticed there were a few questions also about what happens to the carbon dioxide that methane breaks down into. So maybe that's worth answering in the same breath.
Can you come on to that one? Yeah.
Right. But because I mean, as John said, the fact that it's a closed circle for carbon dioxide doesn't make it a closed circle for methane. You know, animals are generating methane that wasn't there before, and that's making the Earth warmer than it would have been otherwise, even though the carbon dioxide is indeed cyclical, and we don't worry about it. And the reason why we don't worry about it is because when grass grows, it absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The animals then eat the carbon in the grass, and then they either breathe out the carbon dioxide again, just as we breathe out carbon dioxide, and a part of the carbon that they eat, they convert into methane and breathe out the methane. The methane is very intensely warming the atmosphere and then breaks down into carbon dioxide again. So the methane that comes from animals does break down into carbon dioxide, but it merely replaces the carbon dioxide that was removed just a week or at most a month before from the atmosphere. And so for convenience, we don't count the carbon dioxide that's removed by growing grass, because we also don't count the carbon dioxide that animals breathe out, or the methane or the carbon dioxide that methane decays into. It's actually the same with humans. Humans breathe out carbon dioxide, and we're not stressed about that at all, because it usually comes from carbon that we've eaten recently, which would have removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere when it grew recently, because everything we eat ultimately comes from plant products in some way or the other. So we indeed ignore carbon dioxide, sort of given that it's sort of fluid within the space of weeks to months. For ease of accounting, we could choose to track every single carbon dioxide molecule that's removed from the atmosphere and exhaled and comes when dung breaks down and comes from the breakdown of methane, and the answer would be 0. So it's kind of, why bother within the space of a very short time. Whereas the methane is generally new. It wasn't there before. It's only there because the animal breathes out methane. And so that does add to the warming, whereas the carbon dioxide doesn't in that case.
Claudia, you'd like to add something?
I'm going backwards again. It's about farmers being concerned about producing animal products. I do think we need to think about the sustainability of systems. I personally do not think that Western systems are sustainable over the long term, especially if we're not, because often they are not within the carrying capacity of the land. That means we have more environmental impacts than the environment can handle. And even though they seem very productive at this time, if we're not paying attention and are careful, we may just destroy the land and may not be able to use it for producing food anymore. So I think that as a farmer, we need to also look and make sure that the system that the farmer himself or themselves is running is sustainable, that we don't have that we actually have nutrient imports and exports nearly zeroing out and such things. In regards for deforestation with livestock, often livestock is a tool for deforesting. That doesn't mean that we're only ending up with pastures and livestock afterwards. Often it's the same amount of palm oil plantations and so on. It's just the first thing you send. I see Martin disagrees. It's easier to get livestock in there, and then you have livestock on there for a while, and then you put other things on there. Martin, you want to comment?
Maybe, I mean, it looks different, and I think in different places in the world. But in Latin America, primarily, livestock pasture expansion and sort of at least semi-permanent pasture is the main driver. Africa might look different. In Asia, it's not a big driver at all. So it's different in different places. But if you look across the tropics, but it's quite dominated by Latin America, where really expanding pastures is a dominant driver of deforestation. 80% in the Amazon in Brazil, for example.
Okay, thanks. Right, I have a thought experiment from Mitch Hunter, who writes, how would you think through this thought experiment? Imagine that a parcel of farmland previously growing feed grains and forage is converted to well-managed pasture for grass-based beef production. We would expect this to reduce net CO2 emissions and also increase net CH4 emissions per pound of beef per acre per year. If those reductions in emissions balance each other out on a GWP 100 basis, how would you evaluate this agricultural transition? Is it climate beneficial? And then there's some comments below that where people are trying to refine the question, but I think that's enough for starters. So it is about conversion of arable to pasture land, assuming well-managed systems. Andy.
I can never go, but John has actually done some work on that in a similar thing that might be worth bringing up as a further explanation. So if we ignore the nitrous oxide that will have been involved in cropland and will be involved in well-managed pasture systems, so if we pretend it's just carbon dioxide and methane, if they balance out on a GWP 100 basis, then temperature would increase for about 100 years, because GWP 100 underestimates the climate effect of cumulative methane emissions for the first 100 years, and then temperature would drop below what it was before. So it would be climate damaging for the first 100 years, and then climate beneficial beyond that if you sustain it forever. How climate damaging, how climate beneficial depends on the actual amounts. That's hard to comment on. But the overall dynamic would be, in the near term, methane is more powerful than GWP 100 makes it sound. In the long term, it's less damaging than GWP 100 makes it sound.
Yeah. John, do you want to come in on that? And then I've got Claudia, and Martin didn't. No, he's given up. Okay.
But yeah, I think that's exactly right. And we in the paper we've shown in some kind of simple imaginary scenarios how these dynamics compare based on your different increasing or decreasing methane versus CO2 emission rates. But the extra wrinkle I would add from what Andy was saying, and this comes back very much to the previous table discussion, is that's if you assume that your CO2 sequestration rates into the soil are maintained at the same rate per year across the whole 100 years. And that's very unlikely unless you were in an exceptionally degraded soil. Your CO2 removal would saturate within a few decades, would be the normal expectation.
Yeah, thanks. Claudia.
And maybe just a question about what is my output of the land? Are we expecting the same output, food output of the land or less? So that is where we need to look more holistic, I think, because the population, global population is supposed to grow. We only have a finite number or like hectares of land available that can actually be used for agricultural production. Thanks.
That's a very good point, Martin.
Yeah, just to chime in there, another alternative is of course to convert that land to produce grains for human consumption directly and not for feed. And then you would probably need less land to feed the same amount of people, and you could plant forest on the part of the land that you spare. So that's yeah, I think that kind of system perspective and the opportunity cost of using land for pasture, for example, or cropland for that matter, should be accounted for. There was another question on that as well. I think I answered it, but it relates to that point.
Thank you, thank you. I'm aware that we've, I'd like to allow 5 minutes for a sort of wrap up at the end, and I'd like to kind of squeeze two more questions in if we can. One is a comment made by someone who says that roughly 40% of methane emissions from human activities, including farming, come from the oil and gas sector. Surely these highly profitable energy companies must be the first place we urgently target leaking infrastructure, as this can reduce emissions much faster than trying to get billions of people to reduce their diets. I mean, there is, of course, it isn't an either or response, but could you speak to that point, John?
I mean, of course, we should expect that. But the companies should do that anyway in their own interests, because methane is really expensive right now. So they should go and fix their pipes to save the climate and increase their own profits. So we should actually immediately be expecting further than just stopping your leaky methane in terms of setting climate commitments. But yeah, the bigger point is just as you say, that it's not an either or choice on this point.
Yeah, Andy.
Just quickly to add to that, I think it's exactly the case that those methane sources are being targeted first. So the Global Methane Pledge that was agreed to during the last Global Climate Change Conference, or called COP26, that is exactly targeting methane. There's a major legislative change happened in the US that will directly address methane emissions, and they are much more easily fixable. We can also detect those sources of methane by satellite measurements now. So it's actually, yeah, I would expect that to be the first target, and it's much easier to legislate for it. And funny enough, nobody has any problem with going after methane. It's sort of only the biological methane that causes more debate whether we should even try to reduce it. And I think that's tied up that it has other values and uses. It's not just a climatic question.
Yeah, thanks. So
I just want to briefly interject, because it is hard, or one of the reasons it becomes such a hot debate is, yeah, we as Andy would advise us not to do, we could do kind of combine the physics of the things with the social dynamic of which emissions do we care about more or less. But on some of the physical points, I think we have actually been fairly consistent that many of these methane principles do apply to fossil methane as well, and have presented the case in terms of kind of natural gas potentially does actually make sense as a bridge for fuel for kind of getting off coal, even if you stick with natural gas for a while and then replace the renewables, that there are actually long-term benefits associated with that. So it's not that it's like only agriculture that we explore these issues with, because it's tied up with all these other values.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so I'm going to allow one more question, and then I wanted to allow a tiny bit of time to wrap up at the end. So the last question, and it's for you to start with, Andy, because I think this is also your patch. Mitigation pathways in the IPCC's 1.5 degree report found that total agricultural methane emissions would have to be reduced by 24 to 47% by 2050, and the New Zealand government adopted this as its target for ruminant methane emissions. Do the panelists think this is roughly the scale of reductions we need to be looking to achieve, at least as a global average? And yeah, if you could be as brief as possible with this one. Who wants to go first?
Sorry, did you want me to start with that? Or?
Yes, yes.
Right. I mean, so what the IPCC reports show, that's what the global economic models see as a cost-effective way of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, making a whole range of assumptions about what emission reductions are actually feasible, but also what demand-side measures are achievable. The model sometimes build in already assumptions about dietary preferences or population. And all we know is that if we don't reduce methane by that much, then we have to get to net zero CO2 even faster, and both strain the limits of credibility, which is why limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is so hard and about to become no longer possible. So it's, neither physics nor economics tells an absolute target for any single sector or gas, but it can tell us about the choices we face, that if we don't achieve something at the global scale, there are consequences. Either warming exceeds 1.5 degrees by even more than it would have otherwise, or we have to go harder in another sector. Whether that's a plausible combination of getting to net zero by 2050 and reducing agricultural methane by that amount, or whether something else is more plausible, that depends to some extent on how much of new technologies we can implement. So keep in mind the IPCC model pathways, none of them assume anything like targeted breeding for low emissions animals, that don't assume methane inhibitors, that don't assume the successful development of a methane vaccine. So all the more out there technological solutions are not included in that. So, and I wouldn't say, therefore we should try to reduce methane even more, but it might actually make it more achievable globally to achieve such emission reductions if we take methane seriously as one component of the things we have to address climate change.
Thanks, Andy. So if no one else has anything burning to add to that.
I want to reiterate Andy's point that the IPCC does not say any amount of agricultural methane is required or is the target. It's saying, based on a set of reasonably sensible but still broad assumptions, this is what the trajectory of different gases look like. We definitely shouldn't be setting our targets from that, I think, and that's exactly where I think we're not having the conversation about translating that into actual requirements per country and what that means. Okay. That's what I'm trying to highlight through some of our more contentious discussions, I guess.
Okay, well, look, in the last 2 minutes, I just think, just to kind of wrap up, if you could confine yourselves to 15 seconds each, what is the main thing you would like to say about methane in the context of our global climate, food security and social justice challenges? What's the kind of the key elevator pitch point? Claudia.
This is really hard. I do think we need to, what we all agree on, we need to reduce methane. We need to, but we need to do it within the global context that we have and within the possibilities that we have, because emissions are not a local problem, they're a global problem. So we need to basically all work together on this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Martin, 15 seconds.
That was an impossible task. So I guess do as much as you can, but be aware of trade-offs. I think that's really what we need to do. Yeah.
Thanks. John.
I'd say let's think first and foremost about what a sustainable food system and sustainable land use might look like, and it's not a single thing, as Andy would said. And then when we've started to identify that, then we'll take a step back and see how far away from net zero under various definitions, and then assess how much that matters.
Thank you. We're out of time now, but Andy.
Just picking up on John's point, I wouldn't stress about net zero for individual sectors, but I would we should get methane emissions as low as we possibly can, as for any other greenhouse gas. But that doesn't have to be zero, and there's a physical reason for it, and there's the whole social environmental context for it. Go as low as you can, and don't beat yourself up if you can't get any lower. And how much that is will vary hugely depending on geographical context, cultural context, etc.
Thank you very much. So thanks so much to all four of you, and to the audience. Just a final plug, we have another event on the 17th of October, which is exploring different visions of what a good livestock future might look like. So thank you very much to everyone for participating, and especially to the speakers. And I wish you all a good evening. So good night.